Welcome to Casual Friday. I have two finished things to share with you, one of which includes a little bit of a follow-up discussion on gauge that I was talking about last week. And then I want to talk about Thanksgiving because it's Thanksgiving weekend here in the United States. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about what it means to me now, what it meant to me as a kid, and how the context in which I understand Thanksgiving has changed from doing family history research and learning to spin and all that kind of thing. If you missed Tuesday's video, I announced that I was re-releasing, finally, version 2 of my reversibly cabled scarf pattern. It's the very first pattern I published 10 years ago. It was in dire need of being updated, and I wanted to add more flexibility to the pattern by offering a variety of yarn weights and also several other options for different ways of using the stitch patterns to create different types of scarves. So if you're interested in that, you can either watch that video or I'll just put a link down below to the pattern. So there is a discussion thread in my Ravelry group specifically for this pattern. So it's sort of like a knit along, but there's no end date. There are no prizes or anything. It's just a way for you to interact with each other as you knit the pattern. If you have any questions that come up as you're knitting, any problems that you're encountering, you can bring them up in that discussion thread, and you can show off your finished projects as well. So if you'd like to join in on that, I'll leave some information down in the description box about that. I showed you this blanket last week that I had just finished knitting for my grandnephew who is going to be born in February. I had an extra skein of the caramel yarn left over, so I thought it would be nice to make a companion project for the blanket, and I decided to make a blanket buddy. Now, I made one of these a few years ago, and it was the first I'd ever heard of them, but I had seen the pattern. I thought it was a really cute idea. And so if you don't know what they are, it's like a glorified dishcloth with arms, and you tie a knot in the arms to help make the arms. And then there's a little head on the top. Now, I've put little bear ears on the top of this. They're not exactly identical. I knit one to try to figure out how I was going to do it, and then I hadn't written down what I did, so the second one isn't quite a match. But the original pattern calls for rabbit ears, and it's really cute. And I'll put a picture of the one I made years ago. I know more now than I knew then, but I do remember that I was a little confused back then about the yarn weight and needle combination. It didn't really make sense to me. So the yarn, I'll put a link down to this because I think it's a really cute pattern, but I do think there's a few things that are helpful to know about this pattern before you knit it. The original pattern calls for a super bulky chenille yarn. And it calls, at the same time, it calls for a size 10.5 US 10.5 needle, which is a 6.5 millimeter needle. So typically a US 10.5 needle is what you need to get 3.5 stitches per inch with a standard yarn, plied yarn, like wool or wool blend yarn that's 2, 3, 4 plies, something like that. You'd use a 10.5 to get 3.5 stitches per inch. This pattern doesn't tell you what the gauge is. In fact, the only thing it says about gauge is that it isn't important. It does give a final measurement of 17.5 inches in length this way. But other than that, it says it's not important. And I remember spending a long time years ago trying to understand this combination of super bulky chenille yarn and a size 10.5 needle. And I think the yarn had been discontinued already. And so what I was able to get a hold of was some worsted weight chenille yarn that I doubled to get a bulky weight, which is what I thought was appropriate to knit with a 10.5 needle. So this is where yarn construction is an important factor in determining the needle size that you're going to need to use with a particular yarn weight. So last week I talked about how chainette yarns tend to need a larger needle than you would normally need with applied yarn. And I briefly mentioned that chenille yarns call for a smaller needle size because they want you to use a firm gauge. So for this original Blanket Buddy pattern, they were calling for this super bulky yarn, and they didn't, like I said, they didn't mention in the pattern what the gauge was. If you look up information about that particular yarn, which still exists on Ravelry even though the yarn has been discontinued, you'd see that it was calling for 2 stitches per inch, and that you would get that using a US 10.5 needle. Now this is a really unusual needle yarn weight combination, but it's something that must have worked specifically with that particular type of yarn, and also because you need to work it at a firm gauge because it's chenille and you don't want it to worm. But anybody making this pattern now is going to need a yarn substitution. So I know back years ago when I knit this, I was looking at the 10.5 needle. I thought that was what was important. And so I found a yarn that would get the appropriate gauge for a 10.5 needle, which I thought was 3.5 stitches per inch. So I made this Blanket Buddy, and it was very cute, but it was much, much smaller than the 17.5 inch Blanket Buddy that the pattern was promising. So while it is true that it's not critical because this Blanket Buddy doesn't have to fit someone, it's not going to come out to the expected size if you're relying on just the needle size to guide you for what yarn to use. So having learned years ago that using a bulky weight yarn and a 10.5 needle was going to get me a much smaller Blanket Buddy than maybe I really wanted, what I decided to do was to look at the proportions, like how and to kind of get an idea using the gauge of 2 stitches per inch to kind of figure out how big this thing would really have been if I had knit it with the actual yarn. And so what I did was I just kept making this bigger. I just kept this pattern, once you get the beginning established, it's knit 3, yarn over, knit across. And then, so at the beginning of every row, you knit 3 and you yarn over, and that's how you're increasing it. And so I just did that until I got something. I didn't get it to be 17 inches wide, but I got about 14 inches wide. So I had a lot more stitches on the needles than were called for in the original pattern. But I just used the proportions that the pattern called for, and in order to kind of guide me to what size to make it. And in the end, this came out to about 14 inches tall, I think. And I don't know that I would have had enough yarn if I had actually made it as big as the original pattern. But I just thought that was interesting. Now, the other thing about this pattern is that if you follow it blindly, you will get the correct result. But if you try to understand what you're doing, which a lot of knitters have done. I've read the comments. They think that the pattern is confusing or that there's something wrong with it, and they just do their own thing when it comes to making the head. So what they have you do at the neck is really interesting. First of all, they have you switch to an even smaller needle. And then they have you work across all of the remaining stitches so that you're decreasing every time. So you do a knit 2 together all the way across, so you've halved the number of stitches that you originally had at this point. And then the next row they have you do a knit front back, which just doubles the stitches. But the thing about a knit front back increase is that it looks like a knit stitch followed by a purl stitch. And what happens after that is that for every single row for the head is worked as purl 1, slip 1, all the way across. So you're only purling half the stitches and you're slipping half the stitches. And then when you turn to work across on the other half of the row, once again, you do a purl 1, slip 1. So any stitch that had been slipped on the first row is going to be worked on the second row. Any stitch that was worked on the first row is slipped on the second row. So you're working half of the stitches each time. Now, I remember when I was first knitting this, I couldn't understand how I was going to be able to stuff anything, how I was creating a head, and why was I why they were having me work half the stitches each time. Why didn't I just work all of the stitches? It didn't make sense. And I got about halfway up when it dawned on me that this must be double knitting. Now, I'd heard of double knitting at that time, but I hadn't ever done it. So let me just pull the stuffing out of here. So as I was knitting back and forth, everything was on the 2 needles. So it was, and it was locked at the top, but I could pull apart the fabric from the side, and I realized that I was creating a pouch by working this double knitting on two needles. I wasn't working in the round. It creates effectively the same thing that you would get if you were working in the round, but you're working it flat instead. So this is why this is so ingenious, because you're working flat to begin with, and then all of a sudden you're creating this thing that's that's going to be 3-dimensional. And then the ears are created, and then while you're partially sealing up the top of the hole, and then you can fasten off the top, just like you'd fasten off a hat at the top. So this is why it's really ingenious. Now, the other tricky thing to understand about this pattern when you're doing the rabbit ears is it uses short rows. Now, it doesn't use short rows with wraps and turns. With German short rows, you're just turning in the middle of the row, and then later you either are working across, or you might be working stitches together. And that wasn't obvious to me either. Like, why am I doing what's going on? And again, if you follow the instructions blindly, you just trust the instructions and do what they say, you will get the correct result. So technically it's possible for a pretty beginning knitter to work this, but not necessarily for them to understand what they're doing or why they're doing. But again, I think it's a really ingenious pattern, and it's really is flexible. You can keep knitting it as big as you want. You don't have to knit it to the number of stitches. But what's important here is to use the needle that's appropriate for the yarn that you're using. And don't get so hung up on the needle that was originally used for the pattern. So if you had wanted to use a super bulky yarn, like a plied super bulky yarn, in order to get something that was correct size, you likely would actually need a much larger needle, unless you were also using a super bulky chenille yarn that also called for a size 10.5 needle. I thought it was an interesting combination of needle, yarn, and gauge that worked in a different way than the chainette construction yarn worked. When I was 7 years old, my mother, my brother, and I moved to Michigan from Wichita, Kansas. My parents had divorced, and my mother was going back to graduate school, and the graduate school she got into was in Michigan. So we moved there. And my mother was an only child. Her parents lived in California, and we had no relatives on the side of the Mississippi that we were living on, east of the Mississippi. We had none. And so since we didn't have family around, and my mother was in graduate school, what she tended to do at Thanksgiving was to invite other graduate students over to our house for a potluck. And so those are my first memories of Thanksgiving. I was 7 years old, and a lot of my childhood memories are based on, was it before we moved or was it after we moved? And that's kind of how I can place how old I was when something happened. So I have definite memories of Thanksgiving once we moved to Michigan. I remember my mother had a friend who was Italian, who's of Italian heritage, and he showed up. Everybody, brought a dish with them, and he showed up with a pan of lasagna. And I remember my mother saying, "Lasagna?" And he said, "Well, it's not Thanksgiving without lasagna." And this was the first lasagna I ever tasted, and I think it was probably the best lasagna I've ever had in my life. He didn't have a recipe. He learned from his Italian grandmother, and it was so delicious. And so that's really what our Thanksgivings were like. They were family of choice. They were mostly friends. Like my daughters in college now celebrate Friendsgiving with their friends before they all go home to their families across the country. And I think it's a really wonderful way for the holiday to have evolved. And it's one that's really familiar to me just based on how I grew up. as a kid, I was very independent and I was very interested in learning a lot of different things that adults did. And my mother was very good about saying yes to as many things as she could, particularly when it came to anything involving keeping the house going. So I remember when I was 9, she had a friend over, a graduate school friend over. They were in the basement sitting in lawn chairs because it was a really hot summer day. And so they were down there chatting. And I went downstairs and said, could I make dinner? And my mother said, absolutely, you can make dinner. What are you going to make? And so I put together, I know it was pork chops and salad, and maybe there was a canned corn involved. But I made dinner. I got a little bit of instruction on how to tell, when the pork chops were done cooking. But she didn't hover over me. She just let me do it. And she did that with a lot of things. And a lot of it she needed us to do because she was a single parent. But a lot of it was she just wasn't going to hang over us and tell us we were doing things wrong. And I know a lot of other people have a different experience with that, especially with learning to cook. Their mothers don't want them in the kitchen, or they're want them to cut things up exactly the way that they think they should be cut up or whatever. But my mom wasn't that way. So when I was 11, then she started medical school, and she still was rewriting her dissertation. So she was, on the weekdays she was in medical school, and then on the weekends she had to go to the lab and work on her dissertation. And so she sat us down. We would have this family meeting, and she said, I can't go to the grocery store. I'm going to need you kids to do it. And we had been going to the grocery store with her every Saturday, and we would go run to the grocery store if we had forgotten something on our bikes. So we knew how to shop. We knew how to pay for groceries. We knew how to do all of that. And we always made a list because that was what she had always done. Well, what are we going to make for the week? And she'd make the list, and we'd go to do the grocery shopping. And so we knew how to do that. So she would write us a check for cash, $50 cash. So this was in 1972. So inflation was just hitting. So $50 cash. We rode our bikes to the bank and cash the check. Then we'd go to the grocery store. We'd buy the groceries and we'd ride our bikes home. And then each of us had to cook dinner twice a week. So by then I already had a couple of years experience making meals once in a while. So it wasn't a scary thing to me. My brother had learned to make things too. My mother was adamant that we would have survival skills, she called them. We had to mow the lawn, we had to be able to sew on a button, we had to hem our pants, so we both knew how to use the sewing machine, we both had to know how to cook, we both had to share responsibility with keeping the house clean. There were no gender roles. There just wasn't room for that. So after that first semester, she finished her PhD, and then it was just medical school after that. So when we would go grocery shopping, one of the things that we always did, because the grocery shopping was on Saturday, is we would buy something for Sunday breakfast treat. So it might be like the Pillsbury Poppin' Fresh dough turnovers or cinnamon rolls or something like that. It would be something that we could kind of bake, and it would be hot and sweet and yummy. And so my brother and I would kind of, fight for who was going to get up early and make the popovers or the turnovers or whatever it was. And then we would get the Sunday paper, and we would get our treats, and we would sit on my mom's bed, and we would read the Sunday paper together. And one of the things in the paper, the weekly insert was Parade magazine. So it was like feature articles, there were a lot of recipes, that kind of thing. And so when the holidays were coming, any kind of holiday was coming up, they would always have, I'm sure they were sponsored by the food companies because the recipes always called for a specific brand of something, but we would find all these recipes. So Thanksgiving was coming up, and we were looking at Parade magazine, and I said, could I make Thanksgiving dinner? And my mother's like, absolutely, you could make Thanksgiving dinner. And she's like, yes, inside, I'm sure. And so I planned the meal, and I made Thanksgiving dinner, and then dinner was just about ready, and I realized I didn't plan for gravy. I hadn't looked up how to make gravy in the cookbook. And my mom's like, oh, I can make the gravy. And I just thought that was amazing. She could just make gravy without a recipe. Here I'd spent all day long cooking this elaborate dinner. I was 13 years old. And I was amazed by the fact that she could make gravy. And I still to this day have never made gravy because that was just something that I didn't do. And I'm sure I could make it, but I still haven't learned how. So then my mother finished medical school, and then we moved again because she needed to do her internship. And so that year, one of the nurses at the hospital where she was doing her internship invited us to her house for potluck Thanksgiving dinner. And so we did that 1 year. And then after that, we ended up staying in the town where she had done her internship. And from then on, she would invite whoever the current intern was over to Thanksgiving dinner at our house. So it was always a fairly small Thanksgiving dinner, but it was always a dinner where we just welcomed in whoever needed a place to go on Thanksgiving. And that's kind of how I have felt about Thanksgiving. And then once I got married and I had kids, my husband's family, some of his family was here in town. And so we would all have Thanksgiving dinner together. And we continue to do that every year. So it has evolved in some ways, but I'm still, this is my holiday. This is the meal that I am in charge of. And I don't mind people participating and helping with the cooking or bringing a dish or whatever. But it is sort of my thing, and it has been since I was 13. And, you know, for me, this making of the making of Thanksgiving dinner is a lot like making birthday cakes. It's a lot like knitting gifts. These are all things that I do for the people that I love. And so for me, letting go of Thanksgiving and like going out to dinner instead, or having it catered, or let's just, forget about it. It's too much work. I would experience a real loss if that were the case. So, at this point in my life, I'm not ready to let Thanksgiving go. I still make it even when we go out of town to visit family elsewhere. I will still make it in a strange kitchen. It doesn't matter. It's just that important to me. So when I started doing genealogical research, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago, I quickly realized that my ancestors didn't actually come all in the 19th century like I assumed they had, but that I had ancestors who had come in colonial times. And I saw pretty soon that they were people who were here before 1700, and I kept going back. And eventually, I did discover that I have Mayflower ancestors. I descend from John Howland and his wife Elizabeth Tilley, who came on the Mayflower. But I also descend from a man named William Bassett, who was supposed to come on the Speedwell, which was supposed to be the companion ship to the Mayflower. But the Speedwell kept taking on water. The two ships left Plymouth together, and the Speedwell took on water, and they turned back. They made repairs on the Speedwell. The two ships left again. The Speedwell took on water again, and they returned, and they decided they couldn't wait for a third set of repairs because it was getting too late in the season. And so they some people said, forget it, I'm not going. And other people kind of just decided to wait to go on another ship once they could find one for the next year. And then the rest of the people kind of all crowded onto the Mayflower, and then just the Mayflower went. So the Speedwell was the ship that the Pilgrims had taken from Leyden, Holland to Plymouth. And then they hired the Mayflower ship, and the two ships were supposed to go together, and then the Mayflower would return to England, and the Speedwell was supposed to stay for a year. And then the plan was they would use that ship to kind of scout up and down the coastline. But they didn't have that because the Speedwell kept taking on water. And it turns out that the crew didn't want to stay in the New World for a year, and they had deliberately sabotaged the ship by installing a mast that was too large for the ship so that it would end up taking on water. And so that was, so my ancestor William Bassett was supposed to be on the speed well, and he had to wait for a year, and he came in 1621, a week or two after the first Thanksgiving was celebrated. He arrived on the Fortune instead. So there weren't that many people in those early years, so those people's children and grandchildren eventually married each other, which is what happened. In my case, one of the grandchildren, I think one of the grandsons of William Bassett married the great-granddaughter of John Howland and Elizabeth Tilley. So that became interesting to me, and I kind of expanded my knowledge of history, and just because of doing genealogy. And so Thanksgiving kind of took a different significance to me. I just appreciated more about the historical significance of it rather than just how much I love the holiday as a way of expressing my love to my family and getting to spend time with them. So as Thanksgiving was approaching the past week or two, I started thinking about my colonial ancestors in yet another way, which is, what did they do for textiles, like for clothing and for woolen goods? Because I didn't think that they had brought sheep with them. And as it turns out, they found sheep to be very tasty, and so they were more likely to eat sheep than they were to raise sheep for the wool. But there were a lot of issues behind the kinds of goods that the colonists could create themselves, like what they were allowed to create, and taxes that were imposed on them, and restrictions, and all the kinds of rules, a lot of which were the reason that we ended up having a war for independence, was because of those restrictions. So I'm just starting to read about it again. I've had these books for a while. This is a book I've had, I would bet, at least 25 years. I don't know when it was first published. It was published in 1988, which is the year that I moved here to Minnesota. So my guess is that I bought this in the yarn shop in the first few years after I moved here. And I'm sure I flipped through it. At the time, it's called the No Idle Hands, The Social History of American Knitting. And I'm sure I read or skimmed a lot of it 30 years ago, but it's been sitting on my shelf and I really haven't looked at it much. I think I looked through it a little bit when I was working on the Master Hand Knitting program, and I had to write a report on the history of knitting, but I haven't looked at it much. And so this is a book that I'm going to be reading through a little bit more carefully in the next couple of weeks. And the other book is one I've had, I don't know when this came out, sometime in the past 10 years, I'm guessing. Let's see, it's called Knitting America, as opposed to another book that's similar in size called Knitting in America. This is called Knitting America, A Glorious Heritage from Warm Socks to High Art, and it has, I think, 20 historical knitting patterns in it. And this was published in 2007. Here in St. Paul, Minnesota. So this is just over 10 years old. So I'm sure I got it when it was new. And I flipped through it, but I didn't really retain much of it. So these are the two books that I'm going to be looking at a little bit more carefully in the weeks to come. So if I find anything really, really interesting, I'll let you know. That's it for this week. If you like my videos, you can support me on Ko-fi.com. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.